My name is Samantha Overton, and if you've ever had to quietly earn your place at your own family's table, then you already know that peace usually comes with a hidden tax. For 34 years, I paid that tax in advance. I paid it in nods, in swallowed arguments, and in a chronic habit of shrinking my shoulders whenever the air in the room grew too heavy to breathe. I am a geriatric nurse by trade, which means my entire professional life is built around noticing the things people try hard to hide. The slight hitch in a gait, the subtle shadow of confusion in a patient's eyes, or the predatory way a relative leans over a hospital bed when they think the staff isn't looking. But on a gray Tuesday in October, I realized that the absolute worst blind spot we possess is the one we reserve for our own blood. I had been working a brutal string of night shifts at the clinic, the kind that leaves your skin feeling thin and your thoughts tasting like stale paper. On my drive home, instead of turning toward my own dark, quiet apartment, a strange, unprompted impulse made me take the bypass toward the edge of Bellhaven. It was my grandfather Walter's house, a sturdy, weathered split level he had built with his own two hands back when the town was mostly orchards. I hadn't called first. In our family, an unannounced visit was treated like a minor border infraction, but I told myself I was just dropping off a fresh loaf of sourdough. I walked up the gravel driveway, the dry oak leaves crunching under my clunky nursing clogs. I didn't even have time to finish my second knock before the heavy oak door swung inward. The man standing there didn't look like my grandfather. Not really. Walter had always been a towering, meticulous presence. The kind of retired small-town accountant who still starched his denim shirts and kept his pencils sharpened to a needlepoint in a ceramic mug. But that afternoon, his face was completely drained, the exact color of old newsprint. His eyes were wide, tracking the empty road behind me with a frantic animal intensity. Before I could even open my mouth to say hello, his rough hand shot out, grabbed the sleeve of my cardigan, and pulled me violently across the threshold into the dark foyer. He locked the deadbolt with a wet click, leaned his forehead against the wood, and whispered the words that I still hear at night when the apartment gets too quiet. "Get inside quickly, Sam. Hide right now. Don't make a sound." I froze, the heavy bag of bread slipping in my grip. "Grandpa? What's wrong? Are you having an episode?" He didn't answer. He didn't look confused or lost, the way some of my early-stage dementia patients look when the afternoon light begins to fade and the world loses its coordinates. He looked like a man who had been sitting in the dark, watching a countdown timer reach 0. He grabbed my shoulder and shoved me toward the kitchen, his fingers digging into my skin with surprising, desperate strength. He pointed toward the narrow, deep gap behind the floor-to-soiling pantry cabinet, a dead space against the drywall that smelled faintly of spilled coffee grounds, dried bay leaves, and old, cold wood. "In there," he hissed, his voice dropping into a register so sharp it made my stomach drop. "Do not breathe loud, Samantha, please." Before I could protest, the unmistakable sound of tires grinding against the loose gravel outside cut through the silence of the house. I knew that engine sound by heart. It was a late-model sedan with a loose heat shield that rattled whenever it came to a stop. It was my mother Paula's car. A heavy, instinctive panic, the kind of old childhood reflex that tells you an argument is coming before a single word is spoken, took over my legs. I stepped backward into the shadows of the pantry gap, pressing my spine hard against the rough, unpainted drywall. I made myself small. I tucked my elbows into my ribs and pulled my nursing bag against my chest like a shield. Through the narrow half-inch crack between the side of the cabinet and the kitchen wall, I had a sliver of a view that looked straight across the linoleum and into the formal living room. The front door didn't get a knock. In our family, My mother didn't need permission to enter a room she felt she already owned. The brass handle turned, and the door swung open. My mother's voice came first, floating across the foyer. It was bright, musical, and perfectly pitched. The exact tone she used when she was volunteering at the hospital auxiliary, or greeting the pastor after Sunday service. "Dad? It's just us. We let ourselves in. Don't get up, sweetheart. We know you've been having a clumsy week." I watched through the crack as she walked into the living room, trailing the faint, sharp scent of her expensive lavender perfume. But she wasn't alone. Behind her came the slow, heavy, flat-footed thud of Gerald, the man she had married a little over a year ago after a whirlwind 3-month romance that none of us were allowed to question. And behind Gerald came a third set of footsteps. A quick, aggressive, metronomic sound. High heels clicking with a hard, expensive slap against the oak floorboards my grandfather had laid down by hand 40 years ago. I stayed completely frozen in the dark, my heart hitting my ribs so violently I was terrified the vibration would rattle the spice jars on the shelf beside my head. I looked at my grandfather through the gap. He had retreated to his favorite wingback chair by the window. His shoulders had instantly slumped. His jaw went slightly slack and his eyes, the same eyes that had just looked through me like a laser, became cloudy, distant, and vague. He looked exactly like the helpless, failing old man my mother had been describing to our relatives for months. And in that terrifying, quiet second, I understood something that made my skin crawl. This wasn't a family check-in. It was an operation. And my grandfather wasn't the victim they thought he was. He was the one running the trap. I watched the strange woman take 3 measured steps into the center of the room. She was wearing a tailored navy blazer that looked too stiff for a casual Tuesday afternoon, and she carried a slim, expensive leather folio under her left arm. She didn't look at the framed black and white photographs of my grandmother on the mantel, and she didn't look at the hand-carved rocking chair in the corner. She looked at the room the way an insurance adjuster looks at a collapsed roof, calculating the exact cost of the debris. "We'll keep this simple, Walter," she said. Her voice had a flat, practiced efficiency to it, the kind of tone that belongs to someone who is paid by the hour to deliver bad news without blinking. She unzipped the folio with a sharp, metallic hiss that seemed to echo off the high wooden rafters. With a casual, almost brutal indifference, she set something heavy down on the low oak coffee table. It was a thick, pristine stack of legal documents. The kind of high-grade, multi-copy bond paper that makes a soft, expensive slap when it lands against a hard surface. "Just a few standard signatures today, and we can get everything sorted out for you," she added, uncapping a heavy silver rollerball pen and placing it precisely along the top margin of the first page. My mother made a soft, low, soothing sound in the back of her throat. It was the exact sound she used to make when I was 6 years old and had scraped my knee on the driveway, or when I was 10 and terrified of the thunderstorm rattling my bedroom window. It was a sound that, for the first 3 decades of my life, had been completely synonymous with safety, warmth, and maternal protection. But hearing it now, from my cramped hiding spot behind the pantry, made the tiny hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It made my skin crawl. "That's right, Daddy?" Paula murmured, stepping closer to his wingback chair and resting her manicured hand lightly on his slumped shoulder. "Renata has been so wonderful. She's worked with so many families in the county who are going through exactly what we're going through. This is just the formal part. Once this is out of the way, you won't have to worry about a single bill, or the property taxes, or the roof leaks ever again. Gerald and I are going to shoulder all of that for you." I stayed completely frozen, staring through the narrow vertical crack. My vision was limited to a sliver of the space, The edge of the coffee table, the terrifying white glare of those unprinted pages, and the left side of my grandfather's chair. And in that quiet, terrible window of observation, I realized with absolute clinical clarity that whatever was about to transpire in that living room was not a supportive family visit. It was a cold, highly organized administrative extraction. And my grandfather had known it was coming. That was why he had intercepted me at the door. That was why he had used his real steady voice to command my silence before retreating into his performance. He hadn't hidden me because he was paranoid or confused. He had hidden me because he knew that if I walked into that room as a professional nurse, my natural instinct to intervene would disrupt the trap he was trying to observe. He needed an independent ear in the wall. He needed someone who could see the machinery operating without a mask. To really understand how deep the ice went in that room, you have to understand who my mother, Paula, actually is. For 57 years, she had run our extended family like an invisible thermostat. If Paula was feeling warm and validated, the entire household relaxed, the conversation flowed, and everyone was allowed to breathe. But the very second she went cold, the moment her expectations weren't met or her control was questioned, the temperature in the family dropped to absolute zero. We all learned very early to instinctively rearrange our entire lives, our opinions, and our boundaries just to warm her back up. Peace in our home was never a natural state. It was a highly expensive commodity, and the currency used to purchase it was almost always my compliance. As a geriatric nurse, I spent 40 hours a week reading charts, tracking cognitive regressions, and catching the tiny, microscopic behavioral changes that frantic families entirely miss. I know exactly what it looks like when an elderly person begins to lose their grip on reality. But more importantly, I know what it looks like when a healthy, clear-minded human being is systematically treated as if they are already dead and buried by the people who stand to inherit their life's work. Gerald, her husband of 14 months, stood near the front door with his hands tucked into the pockets of his expensive slacks. He was 60 years old, wore custom leather shoes, and spent his days talking in loud, vibrating tones about massive commercial real estate deals that somehow never managed to close. I had met him maybe 6 times, and every single interaction left me with the distinct impression of a Papatarsenta, man who was constantly looking over your shoulder to see if a wealthier person had walked into the room. But it was the woman in the heels, Renata Poole, who made my stomach turn into a tight, cold knot. 3 weeks prior to this afternoon, my grandfather had abruptly stopped calling me on Sunday evenings, breaking a strict structural habit he had maintained since I left for college. Around that same time, a certified bank letter addressed to his residence had accidentally shown up in my mailbox, forwarded to my mother's home address. Being a nurse, I had noticed the tracking anomaly. I had actually called the branch manager to politely ask why an accountant's mail was being rerouted to an auxiliary address. The clerk on the phone had given me that cold corporate wall. They couldn't discuss another individual's account status with me. I wasn't an authorized user. I had no legal standing. I remember hanging up the phone that day and spending an hour sitting on my living room floor, aggressively telling myself that I was being paranoid. I told myself that families forward mail all the time, that aging parents need help with administrative overhead, and that my mother was just being a good daughter. I had wanted to be wrong so badly, it felt like a physical ache in my chest. But crouching behind that pantry cabinet, watching a complete stranger command my grandfather to sign away his autonomy, while my mother stroked his shoulder, the illusions dissolved. I hadn't been paranoid at all. I had been early. And worse, I had let my own conditioned guilt talk me out of my instincts. That was the part I knew I would never be able to forgive. Renata Poole walked my grandfather through the paperwork in a flat, rhythmic, heavily practiced voice that felt completely devoid of human friction. She referred to the document not as a transfer of power, but as a protective layer. She said the papers would allow Paula to handle the tedious everyday burdens so Walter wouldn't have to strain himself. Financial power of attorney, she called it. A simple bureaucratic safety net. Once his pen touched the line, my mother would have the legal authority to manage his checking accounts, restructure his savings, pay his utility bills, and oversee his entire estate. Estate. Then Gerald spoke from his position by the doorway. His voice was lower, calculatedly softer than Renata's, which somehow made the hair on my arms stand up even faster. He walked over, his expensive leather loafers silent against the rug, and leaned over the coffee table. He said the property was really becoming far too much for a single man of Walter's age to maintain alone. He mentioned a lovely, resort-style facility across the county line, a premium assisted living community with manicured grounds and round-the-clock staff. He explained, with a chillingly casual tone, that once the house was sold, the equity would easily fund the highest tier of comfort for the rest of Walter's days. Through the narrow vertical crack of the pantry, I watched my grandfather make a small, fragile, entirely defeated sound. He looked up, his jaw trembling slightly, and asked what would happen to his heritage rose garden in the backyard if the house was sold. Nobody answered him. The question was treated like a mild, irrelevant cognitive glitch. My mother moved in closer, her voice dropping into that specific low register she reserved for what she called hard family truths. She leaned down until her face was inches from his. "Daddy, we've been over this so many times. You're forgetting things now. The bank notices it, the neighbors notice it, and it breaks my heart to see you struggle. This is entirely for your own good." Then she uttered the exact phrase I will carry with me like a scar until the day I die. She didn't say it with malice or anger. She said it with a terrifying matter-of-fact certainty, the way an adult discusses the weather over a cup of coffee. He won't even remember by Christmas anyway. A cold shock of adrenaline slammed into my chest. I had to violently bite down on the knuckle of my index finger to keep from crying out. My eyes burned with a mixture of raw fury and suffocating grief. Through the crack, I could see the weathered edge of my grandfather's corduroy chair and his right hand resting on the wooden armrest. And as I watched, my breath caught. His hand was not shaking, it was completely, uncharacteristically steady. He had a tiny, blunt stub of an accountant's pencil hidden against the outer fabric of the chair's cushion, completely shielded from my mother's line of sight. While Paula was delivering her performance of maternal pity, Walter's fingers were moving with minute, precise efficiency. On a tiny, crumpled scrap of paper palmed against the upholstery, he was quietly, methodically writing down numbers, tracking times, names, and specific phrases from their conversation. My grandfather, the man they had just publicly declared too far gone to manage his own existence, was taking clinical notes. If you have ever had to watch someone you love get systematically dismantled by the people who are supposed to protect them, you know the exact brand of quiet fury that was waking up in my chest. I realized then that I wasn't standing in the dark, watching a helpless old man succumb to a trap. I was watching a master strategist gather his intelligence. For the next 10 minutes, Walter put on the single most flawless performance of cognitive frailty I have ever witnessed in my career as a nurse. He forgot Gerald's name twice, referring to him with a vague, watery smile as that nice young fellow from the regional bank. He asked the exact same question about his backyard rose garden 3 times in a row, pitch perfect in his repetition. until my mother's carefully manufactured patience began to fray at the edges. "Dad, please," she snapped, her real voice, tight, sharp, and deeply impatient, slipping through her warm daughter mask like a blade. Renata Poole tried to gently guide the heavy silver rollerball pen into his fingers. Walter fumbled it deliberately, letting it clatter loudly against the oak floorboards, before offering a small, stuttering apology in a thin, lost voice. I heard Gerald let out a heavy, aggressive sigh, the unmistakable sound of a man who was watching a massive financial payout take far too long to cross the finish line. After a brief, tense huddle over the coffee table, they decided he was simply too exhausted to complete the transaction today. My mother kissed the top of his head, her voice snapping back into its sugary register, and told him they would return over the weekend when he was having a clearer day. The disappointment in the room was thick enough to taste. But right before they gathered their coats and Renata tucked her documents back into her leather folio, my grandfather did the one thing that changed everything. He turned his head slowly toward the kitchen, directly toward the tiny dark crack where I was hidden. For one brief, terrifying second, the cloudiness in his eyes vanished completely. They were sharp, piercing, and entirely present. He looked straight into my eyes through the dark, gave the microscopic shake of his head that meant, "Stay quiet, wait," and then allowed the heavy fog to roll right back over his face as he asked the empty room if it was time for supper. The front door clicked shut with a definitive, heavy thuds that signaled their departure. I stayed exactly where I was, my back glued to the unpainted drywall behind the pantry, counting to 60 in the heavy silence that followed. It's a habit I picked up working the emergency room shifts during major storms. You count between the lightning and the thunder to measure how close the danger really is. I listened to the rattle of my mother's loose heat shield fade down the driveway, followed by the distant crunch of her tires turning onto the main asphalt road. "You can come out now, Sam," my grandfather said. His voice didn't have a single trace of the watery, wandering tremor he had just used to fool a licensed notary. It was low, raspy, and perfectly leveled. The authoritative, grounded tone of a man who had spent 40 years auditing corporate balance sheets and balancing small-town ledgers down to the final decimal point. I stepped out from behind the narrow gap, my legs trembling so badly I had to catch the edge of the laminate kitchen counter just to keep my balance. My chest felt tight, like it was being squeezed by a heavy iron band. When I walked back into the living room, Walter was already standing by the windows, his posture straight, watching the empty gravel driveway through a slit in the lace curtains. He looked 10 years younger than he had 5 minutes ago, but his eyes carried an unspeakable, deep-seated fatigue. "Grandpa," I whispered, my voice cracking under the weight of the adrenaline. "What is happening? What was that?" He turned around slowly, looked at my pale face, and sighed. He didn't offer a dramatic explanation. Instead, he stepped forward and pulled me into a tight, heavy hug. He smelled exactly the way he always had. A comforting, masculine mixture of old cedar chest shavings, starched denim, and the graphite from his sharp accountant pencils. "Strategy, Samantha," he murmured into my hair, his rough hand patting my shoulder. "Once a small-town accountant, always one. You learn to watch the flow of the numbers before you make an accusation." He walked back to his wingback chair, reached deep into the pocket of his worn cardigan, and pulled out the tiny, crumpled scrap of paper. I had watched him right on through the crack. He smoothed it out against his knee and pressed it firmly into my hand. On it, written in his immaculate, perfectly aligned cursive script, was a name, a date, and a specific financial figure, $18,000. "That is what has disappeared from my primary savings account over the last 90 days, Sam," he said, his eyes locking onto mine with an unblinking clarity. Small withdrawals. A few $100s here, $1,000 there, spaced out perfectly across the weeks so it wouldn't trigger an automated fraud alert at the local branch. But I don't miss a single penny. I noticed the drop the first week it started. I looked down at the scrap of paper, my mind spinning in fast, chaotic circles. Did you call the fraud department? Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you just say something to Mom? Walter let out a dry, humorless laugh that turned into a small cough. Because if I had called your mother out on it, or if I had told you without any physical evidence, what would you have done, Sam? You love your mother. You've spent your entire life finding excuses for her temperature drops. You would have told me I was being paranoid. You would have found a logical, gentle reason to doubt an old man's memory. I knew that for you to stand up to her, you needed to hear the real Paula with your own ears. You needed to be an ear in the wall. He explained that 3 months ago, under the guise of helping him keep up with his rising utility bills, Paula had coaxed him into signing what she called a limited administrative assistance authorization. It was a single, innocuous sheet of paper that she had brought over during a Sunday dinner. But that single signature had allowed Gerald to be quietly added to his secondary account as a joint manager. Gerald's commercial real estate firm didn't just stall out this spring, Sam, my grandfather whispered, his voice dropping into a cold register. It collapsed entirely. They are closer to losing their own home than anyone in this town realizes. And they've been using my retirement fund to float their interest payments. He had stopped calling on Sunday evenings because Paula had suddenly started dropping by his house every single Sunday at that exact hour, checking his mail pile and monitoring his phone logs. He had faked his cognitive decline, playing the part of a confused, failing old man for one specific reason. He knew that if they thought he was losing his grip, they would grow arrogant. They would stop stealing from him piece by piece in the dark, and instead, they would bring their entire plan out into the light to finish it quickly. They brought Renata Poole because she isn't a licensed legal consultant, Walter said, pointing a steady finger at the coffee table where the papers had sat. She's a predatory notary who works on a commission split. They wanted a fast, quiet execution before the winter, but they don't know that I've already mapped out their timeline. He reached out, his thumb catching a stray tear on my cheek. I'm not afraid of dying, Samantha. I've lived a full, honest life. But I am absolutely terrified of being systematically erased while my heart is still beating. I am not going to let them vote me out of my own home. I drove home that evening with my fingers clamped around the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. My mind was spinning in chaotic, clinical loops. My whole life, I had managed my mother by folding. Not because I was weak, but because in our family, folding was always cheaper than entering a state of war. But now, the war was sitting right on my grandfather's coffee table. Whether I wanted to acknowledge it or not, the old, conditioned reflex in my throat kept whispering that if I just stayed quiet, kept the peace, and minded my own business, somehow the situation would resolve itself without tearing our family apart. But I knew better. I had seen this exact script play out from the other side at the clinic, in patient charts, in tense family conferences, and in the quiet, tragic rooms where adult children slowly drained their parents' dignity. I knew that the cultural reflex to keep the peace is exactly the kind of darkness these financial situations feed on. That night, I couldn't sleep. The adrenaline was tracking through my veins like a fever. So, I did what nurses do when they are backed into a corner. I researched. I opened my laptop at 2 in the morning, pulled up federal regulatory databases, and began looking at the cold, hard statistics of elder financial exploitation. What I found made my stomach drop into a hollow well. Adult children are not the rare exception when it comes to this kind of abuse. They are the most common perpetrators by an overwhelming margin, far exceeding offshore scammers or random strangers on the phone. Nearly 40% of all elder financial abuse cases reported to federal regulators involve an adult child systematically draining a vulnerable parent's hard-earned accounts. And a power of attorney document once signed is a brutal, exhausting nightmare to legally undo. If my mother managed to get Walter's signature on that bond paper over the weekend, she wouldn't be breaking the law anymore. She would be operating entirely inside it, legally, fully insulated by my grandfather's own inadvertent permission. I pulled out a yellow legal pad and started writing everything down with clinical precision. Dates, specific withdrawal amounts, the rerouted mail anomaly, and the predatory business model of Renata Pool. Over-responsibility has always been my deepest emotional flaw, my burning need to carry weights that were never mine to lift. But for once in my 34 years, that flaw was pointed at the exact right target. By the time the sky outside my window turned a faint, exhausted gray, I had a strategic plan that started with a single professional phone call. The next morning, I used my ultimate weapon, my credentials. My mother dealt in emotional manipulation, weaponized guilt, and papers slid across the table under the cover of a loving voice. My weapons were going to be completely different. She worked in performance. I was going to work exclusively in objective documentation. She wanted my grandfather declared incompetent behind the closed doors of his living room. I was going to get him examined in the wide-open light of a real medical facility. I placed a call to Dr. Hale, a renowned geriatrician I had worked alongside for 6 years at the clinic. A meticulous, unyielding man who was famous for double-checking his own double-checks. I laid out the behavioral anomalies I was witnessing without an ounce of emotional hyperbole. He didn't hesitate for a single second. He booked Walter for a comprehensive, full cognitive capacity evaluation for that Thursday morning, just 2 days out. It wasn't a professional favor or a diagnostic shortcut. It was a rigorous on-the-record medical exam with a standardized scoring metric that would stand up in any probate court in the state. When I called my grandfather to explain the appointment, he listened in silence for a long moment. Then, I heard that low, steady accountant's voice return through the receiver. "Good, Sam," he said softly. "Let them tell the town I'm gone. I'll take their test and prove exactly where I am." But the ground was already shifting under our feet faster than we could reinforce it. On Wednesday afternoon, I took Walter to his local bank branch to manually reverse his mailing address and demand a hard copy printout of every transactional log from the past 6 months. We sat across a faux wood desk from a young assistant branch manager named Trevor, who kept glancing at his computer screen with an expression that grew more profoundly uncomfortable by the minute. When my grandfather asked why his official statements had been rerouted to his daughter's address, Trevor's ears turned a vivid, tells-all red. He stammered, explaining that a limited administrative variance had been submitted in person weeks ago, backed by a notarized signature card that had cleared the bank's internal processing protocols. It was all technically in order on the screen, a corporate wall that couldn't be easily dismantled without a lengthy dispute process. Then Trevor leaned forward, lowered his voice, and said the specific words that turned the blood in my veins to absolute ice. "Mr. Rayburn, I should also let you know. Someone called ahead yesterday from your daughter's household to inform us that a comprehensive financial power of attorney naming her as sole executor is being finalized this weekend. They asked us to have our legal department primed to honor it the moment it lands. The rails had been laid completely in advance. They weren't waiting on the bank's permission. They were just waiting for that weekend signature to trip the lock. We walked out of that branch holding a heavy manila folder of financial printouts, but the air outside felt dangerously thin. The trap wasn't just a plan anymore. It was already half built, and the concrete was drying fast. On Thursday morning, I sat in the sterile, fluorescent-lit waiting room of Dr. Hale's clinic for 2 agonizing hours while my grandfather was subjected to a battery of rigorous cognitive diagnostic tests. When the door finally clicked open, Dr. Hale stepped out, adjusting his glasses. He looked at me with an unblinking clinical directness and stated that Walter was easily one of the sharpest 80-year-olds he had evaluated in a decade. Fully oriented, possessing exceptional recall, and showing flawless administrative judgment. He signed and dated the official capacity assessment right there. We had our first brick. The unassailable medical wall that my mother's entire narrative couldn't climb. But it was what my grandfather did in my car on the drive home that shifted the weight of the entire week. He reached into a faded canvas bag he had quietly brought along and placed an old, battered tin box on my lap. It was a vintage holiday cookie tin, its metal edges worn smooth and its lid softened by decades of gentle opening. It had belonged to my grandmother, Nora Rayburn, before she passed away while I was still navigating nursing school. "It's time you took custody of this, Sam," Walter said softly, his steady hands resting flat on his knees. "Open it when you're alone tonight. Read the letter first." That evening, sitting at my kitchen table under the amber glow of a single hanging bulb, I lifted the lid. On top lay a letter written in my grandmother's elegant looping handwriting, penned just weeks before her illness took her. It wasn't just a generic family note. It was a deeply insightful psychological blueprint of our family's hidden fractures. Nora had written about how she had watched money curdle the spirits of other families in Belhaven, turning brothers into complete strangers over an inheritance. But the line that broke something deep inside me was about my mother. "Paula has spent her entire life believing she stands in her father's shadow." My grandmother had written, her ink slightly faded. She grew up convinced that Walter loved his accounting ledger, his civic duties, and the town's worries more than his own daughter. "Some of that hurt is real, Samantha, and some of it is a tragic story." Paula tells herself to justify her own coldness, but both kinds of hurt can rot a person from the insides out. Please, don't let money be the thing that decides who you are to each other. Beneath that heartbreaking letter lay the physical anchor of the entire estate. My grandfather's original, certified, last will and testament, alongside a deed of intention signed decades ago. The documents spelled out in absolute, undeniable legal terms that the historic split-level house was never meant to be a family inheritance. Nor was it ever meant to be sold for corporate profit. It was legally designated to be converted into the Nora Rayburn Nursing Scholarship, an endowment designed to fund the tuition of young women from the county who were trying to put themselves through nursing school. The house was meant to build futures, not float Gerald's failed commercial real estate gambles. I sat there for a long time, the cold metal of the cookie tin pressing into my palms, listening to the echo of my mother's voice in my head. "He won't remember by Christmas anyway." A calm, icy certainty settled deep into my bones. He would remember. The doctor had proved it on paper, and my grandmother had left the blueprint for his defense in a holiday cookie tin. The next morning, Friday, I took the step that crossed the point of no return. I walked into the local social services building and officially filed a comprehensive report with the Adult Protective Services Division. I sat across from an intake caseworker and laid out the facts with the precise, unemotional vocabulary I use when charting a critical patient. The unauthorized address changes, the printouts detailing the $18,000 extraction, the unauthorized addition of Gerald to the bank accounts, and the specific scheduling data for Renata Pool. I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't call my mother names. I gave them dates and numbers, because dates and numbers are the only language a bureaucracy respects. The caseworker looked over the documentation, her expression tightening significantly, and confirmed they would open an official investigation into elder financial exploitation. But then she delivered the standard institutional caveat I had been dreading. An investigation of this scale takes time. Miss Overton, we have to subpoena records, interview everyone, and run audits. Realistically, we are talking weeks. I leaned across her desk. They are executing the final signing this Saturday afternoon at his house. It's an ambush dressed as a celebration. We don't have weeks. We have roughly 24 hours. She gave me a look of genuine administrative sympathy, but shook her head. The state moved at the state's pace. I walked out into the bright Friday afternoon air, realizing that the slow, grinding machinery of legal justice was not going to arrive in time to save my grandfather's autonomy. If Walter was going to be protected from the pen tomorrow, it wasn't going to happen because a state official intervened. It was going to happen in that living room, in front of everyone, and I was going to have to be the one holding the line. By Friday evening, my mother found out about the cognitive evaluation. I still don't know exactly how the leak happened, whether a clerk at Dr. Hale's office inadvertently called her number to confirm a follow-up insurance detail, or if Gerald had a connection within the regional medical network. But when my phone began to vibrate against the kitchen counter at 8 o'clock, her caller ID felt like a physical threat. I picked it up, and before I could even say hello, her voice came through the receiver. The sugary, warm daughter performance was completely gone. It was low, shaking with an intense, calculated fury. "What exactly do you think you're doing, Samantha?" she hissed, her breath sharp against the microphone. "Taking your grandfather to a specialist behind my back? Digging through private financial accounts like a thief? Do you have any structural concept of how deeply embarrassing this looks for our family?" The old, conditioned response, the one that had dictated my behavior for 34 years, instinctively flared up in my chest. It begged me to smooth things over, to tell her it was just a routine clinical checkup, to apologize for causing friction just so the call would end without an explosion. I felt the apology physically rise into my throat. But I looked down at the yellow legal pad on my table, at the figure of $18,000 written in my grandfather's steady hand, and I swallowed it down. "I know exactly how it looks, Mom," I said, my voice flat, cold, and entirely level. She immediately tried to talk over me, unleashing the oldest, most reliable weapon in her psychological arsenal: weaponized maternal guilt. She called me an ungrateful troublemaker. She said I was actively tearing the fabric of the family apart because I had always harbored a selfish need to believe I was better than everyone else. She told me that a real, loving daughter would trust her mother's judgment. "You're hurting the people who raised you, Samantha. Be quiet, let us handle his care, and everything will go back to normal." I waited for the familiar internal collapse to happen. I waited for my spine to curve and for my resolve to fold in half the way it always had. But as I sat there listening to her breath catch, I realized something fundamental had shifted deep inside me. The concrete had finally cured overnight. "I'm not going to argue with you, Mom," I said, and my voice sounded steadier, heavier, and more mature than I had ever heard it in my entire life. "I love Grandpa, and I am absolutely done being quiet. There was a long, stunned silence on her end of the line. In 34 years, I had never once set an unyielding boundary and maintained it in her presence. When she spoke again, the anger had been replaced by a chilling, casual indifference. She mentioned that Walter's 80th birthday celebration was still moving forward the next afternoon. She noted, almost as an afterthought, that she had invited the entire neighborhood, the local cousins, and the retired pastor from First Baptist. "It's going to be a lovely public tribute to his legacy. Samantha," she whispered lightly, "I certainly hope you don't make a scene in front of his peers." She hung up, and I stood in my quiet kitchen holding a dead phone. That was when I received a text from one of my younger cousins. Someone who had quietly stayed in the family group chat after I had been removed from it earlier that week. She sent me a screenshot of the choreography my mother had laid out for the afternoon. The strategy was devastatingly brilliant. Paula wasn't moving the signing to a private office anymore. She had shifted the entire timeline directly into the middle of the birthday party. After the cake was cut, in front of 40 lifelong neighbors, old friends, and the most respected spiritual leader in Bellhaven, she was planning to deliver an emotional speech about the heartbreaking reality of her father's cognitive decline. Then, under the guise of absolute transparency and familial love, she was going to invite Walter to sign the protective power of attorney document right there in the open, with Renata Poole standing by to instantly notarize the ink. She was manufacturing witnesses to her own financial extraction. If 40 prominent members of the community watched a devoted daughter gently help her confused, smiling father sign a safety document over a birthday cake, no judge in the state would ever question the validity of that signature later. They would all swear under oath that it looked perfectly loving. She thought she had loaded the room entirely in her favor. But as I stared at the screenshot in the dark, a cold, clinical clarity washed over me. A room full of witnesses cuts both ways. She had just gathered my jury. The birthday party looked exactly like love. That was the most terrifying part of the entire afternoon. When I walked up the steps of my grandfather's house on Saturday, my own house key didn't fit into the brass cylinder. His locks had been changed for his safety, and I had to stand on the porch and wait to be let in like an estranged stranger. The living room was warm, bright, and suffocatingly crowded. Someone had strung 80 gold balloons across the high mantel, and a massive sheet cake with his name scripted in flawless blue frosting sat in the center of the dining table. My mother moved through the crowd like a seasoned politician, her laughter light and perfectly timed, pausing to lean into the shoulders of elderly neighbors to murmur about how heavy the burden of her father's cognitive decline had become. Gerald stood by the back wall, holding a drink he wasn't actually sipping, his eyes locked on the front door. And near the hallway, hovering just outside the natural flow of the guests, stood Renata Poole in a sharp blazer, her slim leather folio tucked securely under her arm, waiting for her cue. My grandfather sat in his wingback chair by the window, looking small, fragile, and utterly vague. His jaw was slightly slack as he let an old neighbor gently pat his hand. He didn't look at me when I walked in. He was deep in the fog, playing his part to the absolute limit. I took my place near the fireplace, my fingers clamped tightly around the edges of a plain manila folder. I focused entirely on my clinical breathing exercises, forcing my heart rate down as my mother picked up a silver fork, tapped it against her wine glass, and brought the entire room to a standstill. Her speech was masterful. She stood in the center of the floor with tears gathering in her eyes right on cue, telling the room how much it broke her heart to watch her father struggle with his memory and how someone had to step in to protect him from bad decisions. The neighbors nodded along, their faces soft with collective sympathy. "So today, with all of you here, our beautiful community," Paula said, gesturing toward the table as Renata Poole stepped forward and unzipped her leather folio. "Dad is going to sign over financial power of attorney to me out in the open, so there are never any secrets about his wishes." Renata smoothed the bond papers out on the coffee table and uncapped her heavy silver pen. My grandfather looked up with wide, damp, completely confused eyes and asked in a thin voice if it was finally time to cut the cake. The room laughed tenderly, completely enchanted by the narrative. Renata guided the pen toward his hand, whispering, "Just here, Walter, right on the line. Before Grandpa signs anything," I said, stepping directly into the center of the hardwood floor. "I think everyone in this room needs to see a few things first." My voice wasn't loud, but it possessed the absolute, unshakable calm of an emergency room nurse. The room went entirely cold. My mother's smile stayed frozen on her face, but her eyes turned into flat, dangerous slits. She took 2 fast steps toward me, lowering her voice to that private, cutting family register. "Samantha, you are embarrassing yourself," she breathed, her nails digging into her palms. "Sit down right now." The old childhood reflex flickered in my chest one final time. The crushing urge to fold, to disappear, to apologize for making a scene. I looked past her to my grandfather. The cloudy fog in his eyes was completely gone. They were sharp as flint. I looked back at my mother and I did not sit down. "I am a geriatric nurse, Mom," I said, my voice carrying clearly to every corner of the silent room. "I know exactly what it looks like when a healthy man is treated as if he's already dead so his family can clear out his estate." I opened the manila folder and laid the pages down on top of Renata Poole's documents, one single sheet at a time. "This is a certified cognitive competence evaluation, completed 3 days ago by Dr. Hale, the region's leading geriatric specialist," I announced to the jury of neighbors and cousins. "It states that my grandfather is completely sharp, perfectly lucid, and fully capable of managing his own affairs." A heavy murmur rippled through the guests. "And this," I continued, slapping down the bank logs, "is the financial footprint of the last 90 days. $18,000 extracted from his accounts without his knowledge, alongside the authorization forms adding Gerald to his savings, notarized by this woman right here." I pointed a finger at Renata Poole, whose face had gone completely white. "This is an official case number from Adult Protective Services, who opened an investigation into elder financial exploitation yesterday morning," I added, letting the word abuse land in the room like concrete. "And Ms. Poole here is not a legal consultant. She is a commission-based notary who specializes in rushing elderly targets into signing documents before their relatives can intervene." Renata didn't even attempt to defend the deal. The second the transaction turned dangerous, she capped her silver pen, pulled her folio off the table, and slipped out the front door without saying a single word. Gerald looked cornered, his confidence completely drained as I turned to him. "The $18,000 went directly into an account to float your failed commercial interest payments, Gerald," I said quietly, referencing the notes in my file. "Your business closed in April, and you are currently behind on your own home." Then my grandfather stood up. He didn't rise like a frail, failing old man. He stood up slowly, tall and imposing, the absolute personification of Walter Rayburn, the town accountant who had balanced every business ledger in Bellhaven for 4 decades. The fog was entirely gone from his face. "I'd like to say a few words at my own party," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the room. "I am not confused. I haven't been. I've known for months what my daughter and her husband were planning, and I let them think I was slipping so they would lower their guard and show me the entire scope of their operation. He looked at the retired pastor, then at his oldest neighbors. I asked my granddaughter to hide behind my pantry weeks ago so she could hear their plan with her own ears. Everything she has put on that coffee table is absolute fact. No one signs anything in this house today. That was the exact moment my mother broke. The polished, devoted daughter mask cracked and fell away entirely, exposing something raw, loud, and incredibly ugly. You have no structural concept of what I have sacrificed for this family, she screamed, her face turning a violent red as the neighbors jerked back in shock. 40 years I stood in your shadow while you poured your money and your love into strangers, into memorials, into everyone but your own daughter. And I get nothing. You are all against me. The louder she screamed, the smaller she became. I didn't shout back and I didn't gloat. I just stood beside Walter and let her destroy her own public image in front of the exact witnesses she had gathered to bless her. When she finally ran out of breath, her mascara smeared and her hands shaking, the silence in the house was absolute. Get inside. Hide right now, I said softly to her. She stared at me, her mouth open, not understanding. That's what Grandpa told me the day you came for his autonomy, Mom. I'm done hiding. And so is he. The retired pastor stepped forward, his face lined with profound sadness, and placed a gentle hand on Paula's arm, whispering that it was time for them to step outside. She let herself be led past the gold balloons, past the untouched blue frosting, and out into the autumn air. Gerald had already snuck out through the kitchen. When the door finally clicked shut, the house was quiet, safe, and entirely his again. My grandfather let out a massive breath, his shoulders dropping for the first time in months, and looked at the stunned crowd with a dry, familiar accountant's smile. Well, he murmured, who wants cake? The truth, once it is dragged into the open light, doesn't need to make much noise. With the help of Ruth Delgado and the state investigation files, the pending power of attorney was permanently killed, and the $18,000 was successfully traced and clawed back into Walter's primary account. Walter chose not to press criminal charges. She is still my daughter, he told me with that quiet certainty, but she lost the one asset she valued above all else, her pristine public reputation in Bellhaven. The house was never sold. We officially established the Nora Rayburn Nursing Scholarship, funded exactly the way my grandmother had dreamed in that vintage cookie tin. I spent 34 years believing that staying quiet was the only way to hold a family together. But standing in that living room taught me that silence never keeps anyone safe. I started volunteering with an elder advocacy group, sitting in dark offices beside frightened old people, becoming the calm voice with the folder full of facts that I had to become for my grandfather. Protecting the people who raised us isn't a betrayal. Staying silent while they are erased is.